When did your something is very wrong here feeling turned out to be true? I'm a member of a local Facebook group to help moms find babysitters. One of the admins was a mid-20s man who babysat for tons of kids in the area and specialized in caring for nonverbal and autistic children. His posts always gave me, and some other members, a weird vibe, but he was loved by this group as a whole. He was just arrested for molesting 2 children and possession of child porn. Bail is set at $2 million. It's estimated that he sat for over 500 children in our area. Who knows how many he abused. About 6 years ago, my sister and her family were visiting. Her daughter, 4 months old at the time, was napping in the house while the adults were hanging outside. I went into the house to grab something and glanced over at my niece. She was limp and strange looking, like spaced out. It really freaked me out, so I picked her up, panicking a bit, and handed her to my bill. By this time she was back to normal, so we shrugged it off. I said something like, "Oh, I forgot how babies look when they sleep." Within 1 to 2 days, my niece started having 10 seizures a day. What I had witnessed was a seizure. That was the beginning of multi-year nightmare of seizures, hospital visits, neurological testing, and many different types of anti-seizure meds. She was diagnosed with a seizure disorder. Thankfully, the docs found meds that worked. Her seizures went away, and she was eventually weaned off her medication. She has been seizure free for 4 years. Now she is a healthy, beautiful and happy little lady. Came back to work after a week off for Christmas vacation and immediately noticed something was off with my friend. I had no clue what it was, but I just knew something was wrong with him, but I couldn't explain what it was. I kept asking him if he was alright, but he kept saying everything was fine. On the second day he came up to me and asked me how to do something that I know he knew how to do. I had trained him on how to do it. I became very concerned at this point. The third day was New Year's Eve, so we only had a half day, and he was working on a spreadsheet. End of the day came around, and I took one look at it, and I could have printed it out and called it modern art. That's how horrifying it looked. I called the boss over, and he pulled him off of it, which caused my friend to break down and start crying because he couldn't understand that he had done anything wrong. I was moving to a new place over our day and a half off, so I simply told him that something was wrong with him and he needed to get some help. We came back in for one day on Friday and my friend wasn't there. I learned that he was in the hospital because of a heart attack. Later on we learned that during the days leading up he was suffering from mini strokes, and that all of my constant nagging about if he was alright ultimately led to him thinking that maybe there is something wrong with him, and so he called a taxi to take him to the ER on New Year's Eve, where they immediately recognized that he was having a heart attack. A doctor later told him that if he had not gone to the ER when he did, he would not have woken up if he had gone to sleep that night. Because of this, my friend says that I saved his life through the power of our friendship. When I was 19, I was walking home at midnight from a tram stop, and I got the feeling I should pretend I was on the phone. A minute after doing so, a car pulls up next to me on the empty road. It's 4 guys all leering at me. The one in the passenger side starts saying things like, "How about we take you for a good time?" and his tone is predatory. I try to keep it cool because I didn't want to look frightened to encourage them that I'm prey, and start telling my friend there's a group of guys in a car harassing me and describing the car. I hear the driver say to his mate something about my conversation on the phone, and then they take off. I ran home faster than Usain Bolt with 000 now ready on my phone should they change their mind and come back. A couple of months later I hear on the news that in my area there was a group picking up girls and gang raping them. The description matched the car and the guys in it that followed me that night. I had the sense after my encounter to tell my work what happened and refused to do night shift anymore unless they paid for my taxi home. I shudder to think what may have happened if I hadn't pretended to be on the phone that night. Before my husband and I were married with good jobs, we were young and poor and didn't care where we lived. We rented out a shitty little house behind the landlord's house that was clearly a shed poorly transformed into a small studio space. At the time I worked late nights and my husband worked mornings, so I would sleep till around 12 and work all night. The landlord, Greg, was this bold old man with a heavy Russian accent. He was kind of odd but seemed nice. So was his wife. He'd made odd comments and invite me into his house to FaceTime. At the time it was a different program, I can't remember what the online face chat was, with his friends in Russia. One time I complained the chipmunks were crawling into the roof. Asked to patch it up better, and he said bar no need. I take care, and I swear to God he would snatch them up with his bare hands and break their necks. I wish I was making that up. Weird. He made me feel uneasy, but seemed kind to us. When we first moved and I kept waking up feeling uneasy when I should been exhausted. I'd feel nervous and get up, check the doors, check closets etc. One week my husband went away to visit his father and I was alone and literally felt like I was constantly being watched. The bedroom window was back in the yard and it was heavily wooded. I'd hear crunching of leaves and footsteps all the time. My husband said I was being paranoid because I was alone, and I thought so too. But then that same week my husband was away, I offered to watch my friend's dog. So I get home from work around 2 am and get to sleep around 3 to 4 am. I wake up around 8 to 9 am to the dog barking and growling like a made man. Now, because the space was similar to a studio, we had no doors on anything besides the bathroom. I spring up and see Greg the landlord literally in the living room, hand on the front door just frozen. He was caught off guard by the dog and I yelled, "What the hell are you doing?" I thought the house was on fire or something, and I know the front door was locked. I always locked it. He quickly apologized and walked out. When I shook from my sleepy days I realized maybe this wasn't a one-time thing. I took a shower, dressed and walked up to their house. Greg's car wasn't in the driveway, but his wife was home. I told her what happened and asked why Greg would use his keys to go in the house without giving me notice. She was nonchalant about it and replied, "It's his house, he can do what he wants. He liked to check on things from time to time." I flipped out on her. Clearly this was happening often, and the eerie feeling I was getting, I'm 10,000% sure was Greg literally coming in the house, watching me sleep, completely invading my privacy when he knew I was alone and asleep. We noped the fuck out of there as soon as we could. He actually tried to take us to small claims court for breaking the lease, but I had already reported him to the police and found out the space we were renting wasn't even up to code or on the books to be rented. When I was 15, I hung out with some friends after school and got a ride home that night. No one had been home all day, so there were no lights on inside or out. The friend that drove me home didn't stick around to see if I made it in. So as I'm starting to make my way up the walkway to the front door, I sense someone waiting to meet me there. I calmly stop after taking a couple steps and say nope, loud enough for the potential criminal to hear me. Then briskly turn around and walk swiftly down the street, cut through a neighbor's backyard to get to the next street over, make my way to the nearest payphone, dial the police and tell them I think there's someone trying to rob the house. I get back when a police officer arrives and he shines his flashlight around the door and sees footprints in the snow leading from around the house. He follows those and sees they are around the entire house. There was in fact someone waiting for me to open the door that night. I laugh at the thought of their surprise to have some teenage girl acknowledge them from a distance and tell them not today. My siblings and I were swimming at a neighbor's house with their kid, but the adults were inside. Randomly a thought came into my head of where's my sister at? She easily could gone inside or have walked across the street and be home, but I felt like I needed to find her as soon as possible. I got all of us kids to search when we noticed she was at the bottom of the pool, completely blue. She made a complete recovery and is one of the best parts of my life. Edit. Thought I should clarify a little bit and add ways to prevent drownings. She was only 4 and my brothers and I were around 10. One brother got her out. One sprinted home across the street to get my mom, who then started CPR. And I called 911 to get paramedics. We are very lucky and grateful we got a happy ending. But not everyone does. In this situation adult supervision was the key to prevention. But that's not the case in all drownings. A good fence around the water, pool nets / covers, pool alarms, and closed doors, and even doggy doors, are key to preventing children from accidentally falling in. Supervision around water should always be present. And finally, swim lessons. Knowing CPR and knowing what to do in an emergency are also extremely important. Drowning is not always obvious. In fact, it rarely is. All it takes is 2 or 3 minutes. Sometimes even less. Drowning is 100% preventable, so do your part to save lives. My father started publicly dating a woman shortly after my mother died. I later learned she's likely the woman he'd been having an affair with before she died. I liked her. One evening my father took me to one side and asked how I'd feel about him asking her to marry him. I got an awful feeling in the pit of my stomach and felt nauseated. I told my father I didn't want him to, and he asked why, as he thought I liked her. I explained that I did like her, but had a bad feeling, and he said that's just a feeling. They don't mean anything. He already had the ring and proposed straight away. I got really excited about the engagement, the wedding, moving house, and my impending little sister. After the wedding she changed. After my half-sister was born she went batshit. She abused me, my full sister, my mother's child, and later my half-sister, her own child. He only left her when my doctor told him something was clearly going on with her that was affecting my health. She was putting a substance that I'm intolerant to in my food, and my father wouldn't believe me and would force me to eat whatever she made. However, I couldn't get a doctor alone without her to tell them, and my maternal grandmother told him if he didn't leave her she'd go for custody. He accused me of lying for the entire time leading up to that and has never asked me about any of my attempts to get help since. I had a co-worker who used to go to parties in high school. Several of the parties in her senior year were at some guy's farm. She went to one and bailed right away, saying it felt weird. The guy who owned the farm was Robert Pigton. I used to work with a guy from Robertstown near the end of events. A lot of people in town, including the guy, would buy pig meat from Robert. They ate the pigs that ate the women. It's theorized that the pig meat was actually from the women themselves. I want to say that human body parts were reportedly mixed in with the pig parts. The first friend that reached out to me in high school invited me to a sleepover that became a weekly occurrence. Met her stepdad, and instantly my stomach was unsettled. He was weird, tried too hard to seem cool / strong / useful, and stuck around us when we set up the sleeping bags in the living room and hung out. I kind of understood why he lingered the first night, but the lingering continued throughout the couple of years I stayed over. I told my mum I thought he was weird and suspicious, and she told me never judge a book by its cover. One day I found out that she had been continuously molested by him for years and had told her to bring friends over so he didn't molest her. Her mother admitted it was so he could groom the friends. He was physically aggressive with me one day and I never went back. Took a month or so, but I couldn't take it and gathered as much evidence that I could. Things that used to mean nothing were suddenly glaringly obvious that something was wrong, and went to police. I was something I never really wanted to be true, but it had happened before. Same sort of something is very wrong here situation has happened to me a few other times with similar or same results, and I just knew that I couldn't be wrong, but I did question myself along the way. Apologies for the wall of text. This happened a couple of years ago at the church I attend. One day this young lady in her mid-20s started attending our services. She was very polite and friendly and seemed eager to be a part of our congregation. After several weeks she started bringing her brother, who I'll call Brody, along with her. He was slightly younger than her and seemed nice enough the more time I spent around him. However, I began to realize how different he was. He was very socially awkward with odd mannerisms and speech patterns, but I just assumed he was autistic or something, so that wasn't a big deal. I didn't become alarmed until I noticed how fixated Brody was becoming on our pastor and his wife. He constantly followed them around like a puppy, begging for their attention, and growing upset when they associated with anyone besides him. Once while walking beside our pastor, I looked across the parking lot to see Brody giving me the most hateful stare you can imagine. I was instantly creeped out. From that moment I knew something was dangerously wrong with this man, but no one else seemed to notice it. Fast forward to several weeks later, I walk into church for the Wednesday night service to find our pastor alone, without his wife or children. He tells me he sent his family away to a safe place for a few days. Apparently Brody had called the pastor's wife and had threatened to rape and murder her. Luckily he couldn't find a car to borrow, or he very likely would have carried out his threats. After the police came and placed him in custody, it was revealed that Brody had done this exact thing several times before to other women. It was all such a surreal experience. I've wondered if perhaps I should have spoken up about my early suspicions, but part of me thinks I would just been laughed off or dismissed. I was at my grandparents for a gathering and me and some of the other older kids were playing catch or tag in the front yard. I can't exactly remember. Doesn't matter. The younger kids were playing in the backyard, doing whatever the hell kids do. While playing, I could swear I heard a crying / wailing / screaming sound, but it was very quiet and distant. It was one of the most horrific screams I've ever heard, but I asked the others and they didn't hear a thing, and all insisted it was nothing. I don't know why, but felt absolutely dreadful and terrified. Yet everything was fine, so I decided to go check it out. I run into the backyard and it turns out my little sister, 4 to 5 years at the time, was bleeding severely. She was covered in blood and trying to crawl towards the house. I swear it was out of a damn horror movie. Looking back, I can't believe this actually happened. Long story short, my little cousin, 7 to 8 years at the time, decided it was a good idea to play catch with some broken glass he found in the backyard and ended up cutting her jaw very deeply. Kids are dumb. I have 3 children. This is why I investigate every phantom child cry. I've had too many cases of others telling me that no kids are crying, but when I go look, sure enough, crying kid. I had a dream that my brother died the night before he did. Dream Friday night. Found dead of an overdose Saturday. But the dream was so real that I thought it had actually happened for years. My parents didn't tell us he died until Sunday, but I knew he was dead the whole weekend and was confused as to why they were acting like I didn't know, acting like I hadn't seen what I'd seen. I don't really believe in premonitions or anything, but that's something I'll never be able to explain. Still wonder how different life would be if the dream had woken me up and I went and said something to him. It was probably the defining event of my life when including everything that followed. I don't know if it's my anxiety or what, but ever since I was a kid, I would have dreams of something happening in the future, and then usually months or years later something similar would happen, and I'd get serious deja vu. Though usually it would be some situation in the dream that goes south. So then when I get the deja vu I feel kinda uneasy for a little bit until it passes. My mom called me in the middle of the day on a Sunday. I was going to ignore it and just call her back later, like I tend to do. Something just didn't feel right, so I picked up. She was calling to tell me the emergency squad was working on my brother and I needed to get a hold of my dad. I was on the way to a weekend in the Cape with my girlfriend when my stepdad called me. He never calls. He hates technology. He avoids email, calling, anything other than face-to-face communication at all costs. My girlfriend didn't get the same gut feeling seeing that he was calling, so she was confused when I answered my phone while driving. My mom, who had been diagnosed with lung cancer just short of 3 years prior, was in the hospital and he calmly asked if we were available. We immediately turned the car to their home. My girlfriend kept saying we didn't know enough to get scared or to react yet. Maybe it would all be okay. Saying anything she could to keep me sane on the 3-hour car ride. Maybe she was remaining positive. Maybe she truly believed it would be okay. But I knew it was too far gone. She passed about 2 hours after I arrived. Because my girlfriend is the greatest I could ask for and has helped me through the last 10 months like nobody else could. I can't believe people would speak the way they have on here about someone they've never met and only read one sentence about. When my mother started dating her second husband, the moment I saw him, I knew something wasn't right. But being a kid I had no idea what. Fast forward to their wedding. From the moment they were married, he turned into a physically and emotionally abusive piece of shit. Luckily after a while, my mother got up the courage to kick him out, get a restraining order, and get a divorce. I only realized a few years ago that there was something else up with him as well. He would come into my room at least once every day, as far as I know, only when I was awake. sit on my bed, and try to talk to me with a creepy smile on his face. His hand would be on my leg, and he'd get closer and closer to me as his hand got higher and higher. Then he'd get to about my knee, suddenly stand up and walk out. I only told my family about that a few years ago, and I'll never forget the horror on their faces. As far as I'm aware, he didn't do anything to me other than what I said above. But fuck knows, a year or so after my mother kicked him out, he beat a guy half to death with a pool cue. Never saw the inside of a cell. I used to clean vacant houses for a living. One day I was working at a house near the end of a dead-end street, and there was maybe 6 or 7 houses on the one side of the street before an intersection with a stoplight, so it was a pretty heavy traffic area. I was cleaning out the property just fine when my spidey sense went off the charts. I was inside the house, but I'd pretty much dropped everything. Got in my car and started to drive out to there. On the corner I saw a weird looking guy that had a nasty feeling about him. When I got home it was all over the news. That guy was now known for being a cop killer, making the start of his career right on that street corner about 15 minutes after I hoofed it. Told my boss that I wasn't going to go back to that property. He understood. When I was about 12 to 14 I babysat for a couple with 2 kids and the dad gave me the creeps. 15 years later my mom called me and said he was going to prison for raping the daughter over a long period of time. I wonder if it had started yet when I was babysitting them. Just so sad to think about that poor cute little girl I babysat. 4 students of mine won the first prize for a project they did, and we all got a free trip to London. We had spent the day sightseeing and were exhausted, so we got an ice cream and sat on a bench in a park to relax. A couple of minutes later I noticed this couple walk by slowly, staring at us. My spidey senses go mental. I do not like these people for some reason. She walks by and sits on the bench next to ours, and he sits on the bench across from hers. They aren't talking, just looking at each other. And that is when I notice her reaching into her pockets. I jump up, grab my students and run out of the park. My poor students are confused AF and wondering WTF is wrong with me, when all of a sudden we hear screaming. Turns out she stabbed a couple walking through the park, trying to rob them. It scares the ever-loving fuck out of me knowing, had I not gotten my students out of there, we would have been stabbed and robbed. I woke up one morning and saw that I was late for school. I got up, and on the way I'm debating if I should take a shortcut to get there earlier, and decided against it. Now as I'm walking along there was a man who's sitting on a chair near the sidewalk. He stopped me and asked if I was late for school, and he essentially started a conversation with me. Now, I was close to school, so I figured killing a few minutes before my next class started wouldn't be a big deal. As this man keeps talking, he starts suggesting that I enter his house because he's got an Xbox One and a PS4 in there, and that he wanted to split screen with someone else. I rejected the offer, and he kept trying to persuade me to enter his house. This guy then gets in front of me, essentially blocking off the sidewalk, and starts asking why I don't want to enter his house. I gave him a BS reason and said I needed to get going. At this point I'm thinking I have to get out of there cause this guy's giving me the creeps and I don't know what he's capable of. I tried walking past him, but this fucker put his hand on my shoulder and I decided to just run off right then and there. At the end of the school day I'm walking past the same place with a group of friends, and outside of this guy's house are a bunch of police officers and him sitting on the curb with his wrists cuffed. I feel like I dodged a bullet that day. The biggest red flag there is that he asked you to play split screen with him. Everyone knows local Coop is dead.